All right, our final event for today, final part of the event for today is a panel. And the general question is the just war tradition enough for Christian citizenship? Now, there are two individuals on stage where you have not had a general theme, but I mean, we have kind of sub-questions, so yes. Two individuals on stage that I have not had the opportunity to introduce, so I wanted to start by introducing Keith Pavlischek. Keith is a longtime military ethics expert, military affairs expert. He's been affiliated over the years with the Ethics and Public Policy Center, the Berkeley Center at Georgetown. He's presently a senior editor at Providence Journal. He is also he's one of the advisors on the board of advisors for the Strategic Intelligence Program at Patrick Henry College. Keith is actually the reason why I am at Patrick Henry, because it was through Keith that I met Jonathan Binney, who's here, or was here, I don't see if he's still here.
He's around.
He's around, okay. So it was a kind of a roundabout way that I ended up teaching up at Patrick Henry. And so, thankful for that. The Marine Corps thing, yes, that's right. I left out the Marine Corps, long-time Marine, retired in 2007. And then after that, reserve, and then some, went back to active duty for,
I retired in 07.
Retired 07?
Yeah, I was on active duty before that.
Right, but then you went back to Afghanistan.
Yeah, as a civilian.
As a civilian, okay. And then there is Marc LiVecche. Marc is currently the managing editor of Providence Journal. And we haven't actually talked about the website, providencemag.com. You can go to the Providence Journal. Marc is a scholar of just war theory. He completed his dissertation in 2013. Around? Around, yeah.
I think it was.
Yeah, a couple years, okay. He did his dissertation work at the University of Chicago with Jean Belke Eshstein, who's one of her final grad students before she passed. And he has done his work on moral injury in war. And I believe you're writing up for publication, right? Kind of?
Yes.
Yes.
If
Yes.
my wife is listening, yes, baby.
Very well. So, starting this panel off, the structure of the panel, I sent around a number of questions, and the responses I got back were, we like the one question that you have at the very bottom, and that one should be elevated to the top. So I'm going, and then everybody is going to have comments, kind of opening comments around that first question. So I'm going to give you that question in full, and then I'm going to have everyone give kind of opening comments, and then we will go kind of back and forth. All right? So the opening question was, what is the role of educating on the just war tradition in the context of church? So one of the Davenant Trust's goals is to serve as a bridge between churches and the academy, and that is also one of the goals of Providence as well. What are the challenges and pitfalls associated with teaching just war theory and or political ethics in churches and teaching it to pastors and parishioners? So I'll just go down the line this way.
So first, thanks everybody. Thank you for organizing this. Thank you, Brian, for doing all the legwork. It's great to be here. Bilbo Baggins tells Frodo that it is a perilous thing to walk outside your door. And it seems to me that the business of the church is, in part, helping people to navigate some of that peril. And when it comes to educating on the just war tradition, I think the church has been involved in this for millennium. But I think in some ways, maybe uniquely today, given certain advances in our understanding of combat trauma, the teaching of just war tradition within the church becomes at least seemingly more urgent. The breakthrough that I'm talking about, we've already alluded to it in my introduction. We've known for a long time about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which is a combat trauma that comes from life threat experiences, usually manifests in hyperparanoia, hypervigilance, paranoia, things like this. Some time back, Jonathan Shea and a number of other VA clinicians began to identify a second set of symptoms that didn't seem to perfectly map with PTSD, or at least not always. And they began to suggest that this was a secondary kind of diagnosis. And it's not an official diagnosis in the handbook, but it's being proposed. And the proposal is that there is something called moral injury. Moral injury comes from doing or allowing to be done something that goes against deeply held moral convictions. And this doesn't manifest in paranoia or hypervigilance. It manifests in things like crippling degrees of shame, guilt, sorrow, remorse, and the like. Moreover, moral injury, the number one predictor for moral injury is having killed in combat. And it turns out that it doesn't actually matter what kind of kill you've committed. It could be an atrocity. It could be an accidental death, the accidental killing of a non-combatant, both of which I think we would understand how they might result in something like moral injury, doing something that you believe ought not to be done. But it turns out that even soldiers who have killed a lawful enemy combatant under the laws of war, and even the auspices of the just war tradition, these people are also likely to suffer moral injury. And the crisis comes when there is also a bright line between moral injury and veteran suicide. So a bright line can actually be drawn between having killed in combat and killing yourself even long after the combat is ended, which in some ways I think gives pacifists a certain degree of ammunition, which I realize is probably exactly the wrong word for it. That's two more. So in light of all of that, it seems to me that it becomes even more pertinent to help the church's young boys and girls grow into being those men and women who can handle, or potentially handle, best prepared to handle, the morally bruising theater of combat without becoming morally injured, or irreparably morally injured. And this is going to take place over at least three valences. One, just like the time to develop a sexual ethic is not the backseat of a car, the time to develop an ethic of killing is not deployment or boot camp. You have to begin to ask these types of difficult questions early. And if the family and the church, in support of the family, doesn't do that, I don't know who else will. It also has to help form our boys and girls become men and women who can endure the theater of combat itself, so during deployment. And I think the church has a role in shaping future combat commanders who will set the command environment, giving airmen, Marine soldiers, and submariners the ability to talk about their feelings of shame or guilt or confusion or doubt or any of those things. I think the church also has to prepare our boys and girls to become those men and women who can return from combat, so redeploy home and find a church that is actually capable of receiving them. So the education doesn't just go toward those future warfighters, but those who will live in support of those future warfighters and give them a church worthy of coming home to. So that doesn't address the challenges yet, but I think it's enough. I think that's the mandate for the church, and if the church doesn't do that, I don't know who else will.
So I should say, since I'm known as the pacifist that's sitting up here, that I have studied the just war theory pretty carefully over the years. John Howard Yoder, who was one of my teachers, and I wrote my doctoral thesis on him, not only was a pacifist and the foremost expert in the world on theological understandings of pacifism, but was also, by the time he died, one of the foremost experts on the just war theory in the world. He co-taught ROTC students for 15 years at the University of Notre Dame, and I did peace and justice teaching in congregations in the Midwest for 6 years, and in that capacity studied the just war theory quite a lot myself. But anyway, I just wanted to say that. So what I would begin with, I think, is there's a book title by a fairly recent book by Daniel Bell called Just War as Christian Discipleship. I think it's a great title because I think what often is true is that just war theory is understood mostly by Christians in terms of how to conduct foreign policy. But for Christians, just war theory, it seems to me, should be rooted in Christian discipleship. So Christians should be formed to be Christian disciples. Christians should be formed to know the scriptures, to know their own understanding of the Christian faith, and it should form who they are. Because I'm well aware that the just war theory itself can be interpreted in any number of ways, and for our own good and for self-interest reasons, rather than attempting to use it with integrity as it was intended. Related to that, then, I'll say several other things. I think Augustine is very helpful. I have a love-hate relationship with Augustine, as one might guess with a pacifist. But I think his concept of rightly ordered loves is very helpful and very important in relation to just war theory. I would probably understand that somewhat differently from a typical just war person, but I think we need to reflect at a deep level on what it means to have rightly ordered love. I think someone has said, and I would certainly agree, I would agree, I don't know if it said exactly like this, I think you said it, that nationalism is idolatry. Loving your nation is not an idolatry. There's an appropriate love for nation, but it needs to be done with a rightly ordered love. Jamie Smith, I think, is very helpful with that in some of his recent books reflecting on desires and love and so on. Those are very importantly a part of our lives in everyday life, including in how we think about protecting our loved ones and what we will do on behalf of our country or not do. I also want to say, I think Brian, in sending us an email, referenced John Howard Yoder's book on the just war theory, where Yoder argued for years that he has much more respect for those people who allow the just war theory to have teeth. That is, to somehow be taken seriously. I don't think I said this last night, I've said it in conversation with a few people. One of the questions that needs to be asked, and I think it's a question all Christians should live with, certainly in the Western world, is why is it that virtually no one, perhaps no one, who was a Christian in Germany from 1939 to 1945 was a conscientious objector to Hitler's war, other than pacifists like Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Why is it that the just war theory had no teeth to help Germans discern that they should not be killing in Hitler's war? Why is that? My experience in a lot of different congregations in the United States, I've spoken in more than 150 congregations in the Midwest, and everything from Assemblies of God to Unitarians and everything in between. And repeatedly I had the experience that very few Christians think about whether or not they will kill in war related to their Christian faith in any substantive way. Well, if you don't, then how in the world is the just war theory going to have teeth? George Bell was a good friend, Bishop George Bell was a good friend of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he was just about the only English church leader during World War II to argue toward the end of the war that the Brits and the Americans and the Allies should not be deliberately targeting German civilian populations. The just war theory says you don't do that, but it was done over and over again toward the end of the war by the Allies. Now, one can argue that it had good effects. So do you do it or not do it? Do you just do it because it has good effects, or do you stay committed to not deliberately targeting innocent civilians? Then my hate relationship with Augustine is, I think Augustine set in motion this bifurcated way of approaching the Christian life in relation to war, whereas the only thing that matters with Augustine is your attitude. It's not killing in war that matters, but whether you love killing in war. It's as if adultery doesn't matter, it's whether you love adultery. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and it's not consistent with the New Testament. It's not what Jesus says, it's the opposite of what Jesus says. Jesus talks about attitudes in order to help us to see that it's not just behaviors that matter, it's also your love that matters. So you should not only not kill your enemy, I would argue, you should love your enemy. But whether one accepts that or not, and I realize non-pacifists don't, it is the case that Jesus tries to deepen our commitments by talking about motivations and attitudes, rather than pitting them against embodied behaviors. And then finally, my passion these days is that I'm convinced that one of the reasons Christians in many ways approach a variety of issues in troubling ways, and it's this way for some today in relation to sexual matters, is that we don't realize that I think if we read the New Testament carefully, N.T. Wright helps with this these days, but there are a lot of people I could point to, that we realize that the gospel of Jesus Christ in itself is inherently theopolitical. We should live in whatever society we live in as resident aliens, because we have a particular theopolitical identity as Christians that will always cause us to love the people around us always cause us, because of that, to identify with them in some ways, and always realize that, of course, we are out of sync in some ways with whatever culture we happen to find ourselves, because we're Christians. It seems to me that Catholics, at their best, see this in relation to abortion, so that when they discipline certain politicians because they don't seem to care whether or not they're promoting abortion, then it's showing that the Catholic faith is inherently theopolitical. It seems to me we should do that in relation to all issues, which includes how we use our bodies in relation to violence.
I've been teaching the just war tradition for some 25 years now. I've taught it in a professional military education context, as well as in is this on? University context. And I've become convinced that one of the main points you have to make is that just war is, as Paul Ramsey emphasized, is part and parcel of the notion of Christian statecraft. Not just a Christian view of politics as a moral, abstract moral theory out there to which we reflect on those things, but it's a concrete way of going about Christian statecraft. And that understanding stands in stark contrast with another Christian understanding of Christian discipleship. And we've heard that here. And so I think there's a lot of confusion out there, and a lot of the confusion I'll explain in a second. But what I wanted to do was go back to the dark ages of the mid-1960s, when the great Paul Ramsey, who's the greatest Protestant, he happens to be a Methodist, greatest Protestant reflector in the late 20th century on just war. He revived the tradition among Protestants when it was perceived to be an exclusively sectarian thing of Roman Catholics. Niebuhr didn't do it. Niebuhr had a very low opinion of Roman Catholics and just war. Reverend Niebuhr was not a just war theorist. Right? Read The Nature and Destiny of Man, he doesn't tell about that. Ramsey was, and he revived the tradition. He says, and he asked this question in Can a Pacifist Tell a Just War? That's the title of the essay in the book Just War. What happens when Christians affirm that making justice by suffering and nonviolence, and never by the sword, constitutes the form of all Christian obedience? What happens when perfectionism is made the ground floor of the Christian life? This can best be seen by looking at the sects of the age of the Reformation, to which passed the time-honored fervor of Christian perfectionism. Menno Simmons founded one of these sects upon the premise that the sword, this is from the Schleitheim Confession, the sword is ordained outside the perfection of Christ. Now, he's in dialogue with a Catholic pacifist named James Douglas. It is hard to know how to deal with someone who, like James Douglas, and I would say a lot of moderns who think like him, who announces the same premise concerning Christian obedience, and yet wishes, in the tradition of the great churches, the Reformed, the Lutheran, Catholic churches, to continue to talk relevantly about politics. This leads him to the conclusion that the sword is ordained nowhere and never at all, at least not in the modern period. Okay? What he's doing is he's highlighting a difference between modern pacifism and what I call classical Schleitheim Confession type of pacifism. The pacifists who said, the sword, yeah, it is ordained outside the perfection of Christ. God wants the civil magistrate to use it, to punish evil with the sword, and it wasn't a metaphor, to kill evildoers and to promote the good. And I always make the crack, well, they don't make Mennonites like they used to, right? Now the sword, in this tradition, is ordained nowhere and never. Whereas for the Schleitheim Confession, it's ordained outside the perfection of Christ. Now, there's been a movement over the past several decades that, for often good reasons of ecumenical dialogue and discussion, etc., to split the difference, right? So you know, we don't want the belligerency of the just war tradition, and we can't live with the pacifism of the, or the dualism, or the radical dualism, or the sectarianism of the pacifist tradition. So we want to split the difference. My argument that I keep thundering home in talking in my talks and my writings is that leads to nothing less than confusion and incoherence, right? You've got the just war tradition, and it cannot be, there's no tertium quid here, okay? There's between Christian pacifism, particularly of the Christological variety, right? And the just war tradition. And any attempts, and this is my problem with just peacemaking, and various other ways to split the difference. It leads to massive confusion among the people that need to be thinking about these things. Now, I'm going to stop there. There may be some questions about that, but in answer specifically to the question is, I think when we talk about the just war tradition, it's an opportunity to bring clarity. So then we can move on to the broader questions about what does it mean to be a faithful Christian doing statecraft. But first, you have to be clear about those who reject the very idea of statecraft as a practitioner.
So I'm certainly the least expert person on the stage. I'm neither a practitioner nor have I been studying the subject for decades, but I have done a bit of pastoral work in my church, so I know a bit about education in the church community, at least in practice. So my thought would be, I don't think we have just a problem about educating about just war, but about how to think ethically as a Christian at all. Like, I think the first problem we have to engage with is the people who are like, what? I need to think about this, kind of. And then you can start with, how do Christians think ethically? And I think from my book and other places, I would say there's two sources. There's Scripture, and there's the created order, natural law. And I think getting parishioners, people to start reflecting on both of those things very deeply, and I think they're in accord because God made them both. And finding ways to do that, to get people to constantly be in Scripture, be memorizing what Jesus said, what the Old Testament said about these things, and be reflecting upon how God made us, what that entails for justice. And once you have that in place, then you can talk about the foundations of just war theory. I think is just the principle of justice, the virtue of justice. And you can teach that before you get to just war theory, because in a way, just war theory is a part of justice that only applies to a very specific set of people, especially within the church. So you may not need to teach a full course on just war theory to every person in your church. You could talk about it briefly in some contexts, but teach the principle of justice. Like, you give to people what they deserve. That means if they haven't harmed you, you don't harm them. You teach your children these principles. But to understand the full meaning of what that entails, you'll eventually get to the just war criteria, as far as I can see. So it's sort of a basic moral education that I think the church needs to work on. And that's within that context, then just war education makes sense as an implication of justice, and for the people in your church who may be involved in these kind of tasks, then you can give them very specific kind of pastoral counsel.
So, general question. What, in your experience, is the hardest thing for individuals to understand about the just war theory? Kind of wrap their heads around. This kind of goes to the issue of educating people on just war theory. What is the kind of some of the major stumbling blocks?
I think the simplest kind of Christian attitudes are either a kind of very simple Christian pacifism or a total kind of realism. Like I've heard Christians say, war is hell, essentially that kind of Sherman rhetoric. And so if the war is just, then anything goes, essentially, if the cause is just. And I think so getting them to understand that no, justice applies while you're fighting as well as before you decide to fight. And there's, that means don't do certain things that might be tactically advantageous, but are abhorrent, So I think getting Christians to understand that is a good place to start, and I think it's not always known.
Quite frankly, when I teach it within a military environment, they get it immediately. And they get it because the genealogy of to understand modern laws of war and rules of engagement, or at least the logic of the rules of engagement, even when you may think they're too strict or too lax. The genealogy of that is from the just war tradition. You can't escape it. And you can trace it back to the modern period, to the reformers, to the medieval period, back when it's there. You can't escape it, and they get it if you teach it well, because intuitively they understand the basic distinction between intentionally killing combatants, collateral damage, and how that plays out. Where I find massive confusion out there is by people who should know better, among academics, right? And this came up just a week or two ago. Our friend Marc sent me this link of a theologian who sets up the debate like it's okay. I'm going to enter the dialogue between Reinhold Niebuhr and John Howard Yoder. And it's like, again, this is my example. Well, why do those guys set the terms for the debate? And it's like, I say, what about Calvin? What about Thomas? What about the early modern just war people? What about Paul Ramsey? Paul Ramsey is like just sort of left out in all this stuff. And I'm resistant to academics who think that, in order to discuss war, the ethics of war, I have to engage Reinhold Niebuhr. Well, I'm not particularly interested in engaging Reinhold. Don't get me wrong. In a lot of concrete policy issues, Niebuhr is worth listening to. But when Niebuhr does theology, I just kind of like roll my head, roll my eyes, and want to throw the book against the wall. Okay, so people are, to the extent that people are seeing this kind of thing in the blogs by responsible people, it's enormously frustrating to me. So getting over that lump, you have to find creative pedagogical ways to tell people, hey, I'm sorry, Reinhold Niebuhr and John Howard Yoder are not the be-all and end-all that set the terms for the debate.
Keith, my guess is you and I would have more agreement than you might imagine.
No, we
No, in terms of understanding some of these things. That is, I also think Niebuhr, obviously I think John Howard Yoder is pretty good for defining pacifism. He knew it more carefully and had a more theologically robust understanding of pacifism than most. But my experience tells me that a lot more people are influenced by Reinhold Niebuhr than by somebody like Paul Ramsey, which I heard you saying as well. And I don't think that's very helpful. I'm much happier for somebody to live with Calvin's writings, with Thomas, because there's much more substance there. With Niebuhr, you have a sense of guilt, but he doesn't really give you much substance for how you do discernment. Whereas Calvin and Thomas give you more substance, Augustine give you more substance for wrestling with the relevant issues. And I want to make myself clear so I'm not misunderstood. I agree with you and I don't disagree with you on one other thing probably. That is, when I say that I think for Christians just war should first be a matter of discipleship, I mean we should be formed as individuals so that we know what justice means at a deep level. And we have enough compassion and empathy that we're not willing to carelessly bomb innocent civilians just because we're mad as hell. So we know what justice is, and we know what compassion is and empathy is, so that we need those developed at a deep level. And then I totally agree that for those who adhere to the just war theory, thinking about it in relation to statecraft is different from how you think about being a disciple in church. They're not the same thing. I think all disciples should be formed as disciples, and it should influence what we do with our bodies day to day. And that includes, if we're in government, what we do with our bodies in government, or as a soldier. But then I realized, and so I do not put all soldiers in the same bag. Obviously, there are better and worse ways to conduct yourself if you're in the military. So, yeah, enough said.
Just a quick addendum. I mean, Yoder though, himself, sets himself over against Niebuhr. So, repeatedly. In other words, I'm incredibly impressed by how he was trying to save people from Niebuhrian realism. And so he himself set up the contrast repeatedly. And even, I read a lot of passages too. It's sort of continually engaging Niebuhr as the main foil.
Well, for Yoder, biographically, that's because Niebuhr had written so much attacking pacifism.
Yeah.
So Yoder had to respond to that.
Fair enough. Well, I have a lot of problems with Niebuhr, but I think his criticism of pacifism is legitimate.
Well, I'm just going to keep on Niebuhr bashing here if I can, because I want friends. The original, or the question was sort of,
What's the stumbling block?
what's the stumbling block?
What's it hard for?
So I think the stumbling block has been alluded to several times, and say concretely, I mean, how on earth do you in a loving way kill one made in the image of God, right? That's got to be the stumbling block for everything, at least a stumbling block for everybody. And we can get into that in a bit, but there's a couple micro steps that I want to address first. So for me, the question, how do you kill one made in the imago Dei, has to be qualified by, okay, we'll address that, but also what do you do, as I think I said this last night, when one imago Dei is kicking in the face of another imago Dei. And you have to act. And you know, the conditions of life are such that goods very often conflict. We're probably in agreement that Christians ought never to do evil, moral evil, so that good might result. But what do you do when goods conflict? And you have to act. You have to do something. On the Niebuhr issue, I think we very often respond to trauma at the level of a one-cell organism, which is a helpful place to start. But it's either a or an kind of response. And I think repulsion is a useful epistemological tool. I think it points toward things that ought to be recognized. The emotions have epistemological value. Leon Cass has a great article on I can't remember what it's called. The virtue of repulsion. Something like this. Anyway, look it up, you'll find it. It's a great and necessary article. It's got to be qualified and handled carefully, etc. So when it comes to violence, you see this in cowboy films. I love Westerns. But one of the things I hate about Westerns is that the man of violence at the end is always sent away. And it's as if we think, well, you've got a place to reorder society or to pave the way for civilization. And now, we're grateful that you've done that. Now go the hell away. Because we don't have a place for you here. And I think that comes from a place of repulsion toward violence, a recognition that given the conditions of the world, sometimes violence is required in order to bring about other goods, but then we don't know what to do with it. And I think a lot of this, it's not to suggest that John Ford read Niebuhr, but I think Niebuhr is simply in the air. And Niebuhr, if moral injury is doing what you believe to be against deeply held moral norms, Niebuhr, because he believes that killing is wrong, but in war it is necessary, he has made the very business of war fighting morally injurious. And that's a problem, because there is a Niebuhrian lack of nuance that I think Bonhoeffer probably had in some ways. That might be a Lutheran thing, I don't know. I have a lot of good Lutheran friends. On this point, we very often disagree. But I think your comments on Augustine and intention, where you said, to kill that you might kill, but you must do so without love in your heart. It's like saying, oh, you can commit adultery, but you must not love the adultery, right? I think that's mixing the categories just like Niebuhr does. And I think that points to the kind of work that the church needs to be doing. The church needs to render distinctions between things like moral and non-moral evils, which I think is a thing that Niebuhr misses completely. I think intention, as in some sort of as a willingness to do something versus an active desire for the thing itself. So intention matters, and I think Augustine gets to some very important distinctions in what intention might look like. And this all leads to the idea that, look, killing comes in different kinds. Common law, common sense knows that. Your pairing would have been better. Instead of saying killing and adultery, it would have been better if you said murder and adultery. So, it is lunacy to say, oh, you can commit adultery, but you can't do it loving the adultery. But that's saying, well, you can murder, but you can't murder loving the murder. But if killing comes in different kinds, then to say kill and adultery in the same sentence might not be the honest pairing. Some killing is always wrong, and Christians must never do it. We call that murder. Some killing is perhaps morally neutral, accidental death. And there could be varying degrees of culpability that lead up to that accident, but by and large it's morally neutral. The just war tradition says there's another type of killing that in certain circumstances, giving conflictual goods in the world, this type of killing or the risk of lethal action is morally permitted. And frankly, even at times morally obligatory. I had to say that because if I didn't say it, Keith was going to get me an Indian burn, and I don't like that. So I'll leave it there.
The time we have, I want to ask one more of the questions that I sent out to you, and then I want to open it up because I'm sure the audience has some questions for the entire panel. And that is, we see a lot of recent work being done on, I'm thinking of Tobias Winwright and work being done on postbellum, the question of justice postbellum. There's been a little bit of work on justice antebellum issues. One thing that tossed around is what is the applicability of the just war tradition outside of a war framework? That is peacetime, we're talking policing, we're talking law enforcement, whistleblowing, intelligence operations, surveillance, etc. So what's the applicability?
I'll be very brief just to set you up. It'll be beautiful. One thing I want to say is that the just war moral framework provides no new moral legislation. I think in a world in which goods conflict, the just war tradition is basically how we make everyday decisions. So you think of something like surgery. The lopping off of a child's leg is not a good thing, right? But there are conditions in which that leg needs to come off in order to save the child. We've got a conflict of goods, and the loss of that leg is an evil. It's the deprivation of the good, the essential good of bodily integrity and wholeness and all of that. And the surgeon's going to go through the same basic framework. Is he a right authority? Can he make the judgment? Is there a just cause for lopping off the leg? Or are we going to be proportional? Are we only going to remove what needs to be removed? Are we going to be discriminate? Are we going to have to lop off both legs or just the gangrene one? All the way through, and last resort, we tried everything else first. So at one level, absolutely, the just war framework is applicable widely because it's how we make everyday decisions about conflicting goods.
A couple of comments. One I meant to make in my opening comments to tie in. I had this down anyway, but you talked about moral injury. I want to say this carefully, so I hope I do. There's what I think is a wonderful essay by psychiatrist Warren Kinghorn, he's a psychiatrist. He also has a PhD in theology for a doctoral thesis he did under Stanley Hauerwas. He's not a pacifist. But this is my very quick summary of what he says, using Thomas largely in what he writes. And he basically says that we shouldn't simply deal with moral injury of soldiers in a therapeutic kind of way, as important as that is. Obviously, he knows that as a psychiatrist. But it also might give us signals of injuries that are in some ways quite appropriate. If some soldiers have deliberately killed innocent civilians, if they've done things that are horrible, then they should have moral injury. It's a reminder of who we are and who we should not be. And so we need to help them as a church, not simply to deal with their own individual therapeutic need, but also to recover their identity morally, so that they would be shamed to do that in the future. And then, of course, you deal with their shame and so on, again, therapeutically. But you also help them to recover the moral center of who they are. So anyway, I just wanted to say that. And then the other thing I wanted to say, I always find it interesting, I always find it bizarre, really, with this kind of analogy, that cutting off a child's leg. Of course we do that because we love the child and we want them to get better, unless we're just torturing them. If we're torturing them, we know it's horrible. So we have in mind something that's clearly done for a good purpose out of love for that child. It's always interesting to me that we see that not employing violence within a society is a good. So that in this country, there are few, is there anything worse, maybe what was done to Native Americans, but apart from that, nothing was worse in this country than the enslavement of African Americans and the ongoing abuse of African Americans up through the 1950s. My guess is no white people sitting in this room are unhappy that Martin Luther King Jr. won over Malcolm X and others, who thought that a lot of violence should be done to those people who had been oppressing them for centuries. Why do most of us think that? Because we're all fellow Americans. Was there a horrible injustice done here? Did it need to be corrected? Of course it did. And one could certainly make arguments, coherent arguments, why it's worth killing a lot of people, a lot of heads should roll with all the things that were being done. But I'm incredibly grateful that Martin Luther King Jr. won out over some of the others who wanted heads to roll. And my guess is everyone in this room agrees with that. Why? Why? It was a horrible set of injustices that needed to be set right. But we didn't think that violence was the answer. We're very happy it was resolved with nonviolence.
Well, I was in favor of sending the 101st Airborne to fixed bayonets to integrated schools in Arkansas, and so was Martin Luther King. That was at least a threat of violence, and the nationalization of the National Guard to shut down George Wallace was a very active threat of violence. Okay, so that's my commentary. That yeah, you know, one can say that. Yeah, I'm glad Martin Luther King won out over Malcolm X, and I'm glad that they weren't pacifists.
King was?
Of course not. He did. He did.
I think we would have been surprised.
He did not. He didn't speak up and say, "Oh no, we should use apparently passive, nonviolent resistance instead of sending troops to integrate the schools." And anyway, okay, we don't go. To the question about applying the just war tradition to use post bellum, and this actually gets to Susanna's question as well, the last panel. I'm not a big fan of expanding the use of bellum into those areas, quite frankly, because I think the use of bellum incorporates those notions in a broad way. This gets to the notion of intention, that one of the use of bellum criteria is right intention, and often it pulled out from that is to establish peace, or in other words, you go to war to establish. The peace that is to be established in the just war tradition is not the eschaton. It's not the new heavens and the new earth. It's a tranquility of order. It's much more low flying than establishing some sort of perpetual peace, right? Okay. So I think, and I'd have to work this out. I think the temptation in order to do that is done by folks who are suspicious of the statecraft that's required, the complex prudential nature of establishing internal order, even in matters post-intervention.
What do you mean by suspicion?
Well, I think by suspicion, I get back to this notion that a lot of people think of the just war tradition as this hovering moral checklist up there, You know, and so that's why I use the term statecraft. It's a craft. It embodies wisdom and the application of prudential wisdom. And so if you're looking to run the calculus, right, post-bellum, well, here's what it's got to look like in a post-war situation in which, you know, we may be occupying either unilaterally or multilaterally and trying to develop, you know, nation building and all that. I don't think there's any calculation or formula. It's sort of making it up, not making it up as you go, in the sense that it's up without normative guidance, and that's what the just war tradition provides in a war situation, and Christian notions of statecraft provide after. So if you start with the just war tradition as this, it's got to carry all this burden. It's just not designed. It's not designed to carry that kind of weight in these post-bellum situations. That's what international relations is statecraft, and hopefully Christians in those disciplines can actually, are cast to diplomats and they sort of have to be working out for themselves, and there's no easy answer. But it's like the rest of them. You know, it's like born into marriage. It's like, what calculus is there to figure out what your marriage is going to look like 15 years down the road? When you're like, one Stanley Hauerwas says, you never end up married to the person you married, because 15 years later they change, you change, and it's like, so what? It's true for all of life. It's no different. It's a different sort of complexity. When you're dealing with international relations and statecraft.
So then, would you feel uncomfortable, because I'm trying to reconcile what both of you have said here in a little bit, and would you feel comfortable describing the just war theory as a theory of, well, the term a theory of public order, or not managing, but maintaining public order, or statecraft, or a theory of statecraft?
So the reconciliation, I think, is simply, all I'm saying is that the just war tradition as a framework for statecraft came out of the same kind of moral deliberative process that we go through for making other kinds of moral decisions, especially in situations where goods conflict. I don't think the just war tradition should be expanded to include the use post-bellum, because I think it's already there, all of that. So I think I'm just talking about the sort of the foundational stuff that undergirds it. Isn't shockingly new. It's been applied in a very unique, elegant, Trump would say, elegant way to statecraft.
Well, when I first started doing this, the public authority criteria was sort of like the Rodney Dangerfield thing. It was like, it was either so obvious, or a lot of the people that would discuss it says, well, let's determine if not getting congressional approval is a legitimate authority, or the War Powers Act is constitutional. No, that's not what legitimate public authority is about. Legitimate public authority is simply that the highest political authority is the one that has, in a realm, has the authority to make these decisions, right? And it was until Jim Johnson pointed out, well, the first thing that Aquinas addresses, in the Summa is legitimate public authority. And then it started to click to me, what he was affirming, he was also denying. He was denying the use of war for private ends. Now, that's so obvious to us now, but it wasn't obvious to medievals, in which you had combat for private ends, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot more to say, but that's why I'm so impressed by the notion that just war is a part and parcel of statecraft, because it assumes from the get-go that legitimate public authority.
Okay, we're going to open up. We're going to open up for questions. I think, since we only have one microphone, this is going to be a bit tricky. I think what we'll do is, if you have a question, yell it. And then
Suzanne's volunteering.
Should I take it around?
Yeah.
Or they take it around?
I'm gonna have to come back up.
Yeah, the mic has to come back up. That's the tricky
So how
part.
about they go to you? Walk up, just
Yeah,
stand by
you
yourself.
oh, that's true. We can
stay
walk
back
up. Okay.
Do you feel that the responsibility to protect would potentially offer either a higher threshold or an alternative where there could be some sort of reconciliation between, I think, some of the disparity between pacifism and non-pacifism? None at all?
No. I'm sorry.
Well, can I just say one thing that I was saying earlier in a more private discussion? That it sometimes, for one thing, pacifism is not spelled with 2 S's and a V. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was not doing nothing in Nazi Germany. Most Germans who were Christian were doing nothing effectively, or helping Adolf Hitler. That's not doing nothing, I guess. But more importantly, related to this, it needs to be kept in mind that everybody draws a line at some point if you're trying to be moral as Christians, so that those committed to not deliberately attacking civilian populations don't do it. It's not who we are. We don't do it. Don't tell me it's effective. You may think it's effective. It may be effective. But we're not going to do it because this is not who we are. Some Christians believe the same thing about torture. I'm convinced that in some situations, torture might be effective. There are arguments to be made for and against that, it seems to me, in terms of effectiveness. But some Christians would argue that torturing people, I don't care whether it's effective or not, we don't do it, it's not who we are. So then you protect because we care about people we love and care for, we care about fellow Americans or whoever they are, but we're not going to violate our own identity to protect other people, even if you're going to tell me it's effective. Pacifists draw the line differently. I'm convinced this many years later, we ought to realize that maybe stopping Hitler was worth 57 or 8 million people dying, more than half of whom were civilians. Maybe that's true. I would want to suggest that this many years later, we ought to want to come up with an alternative to war in that case, and to remind everybody, especially those who don't know much about World War II, no country went to war in World War II to save the Jews. Not one country. That's not why they were in the war. We often kind of think of that and emotionally kind of emote about that in retrospect, but that's not why they went to war. But more than 55 million people died, more than half of them civilians. That's a lot of carnage. So I understand the goods. My father is a World War II veteran. I understand the goods of World War II, but it was a lot of carnage. And so we ought to want to do things in ways that protect, and also in ways that sustain the order of the world, and so on. And then we all have an identity. We draw lines relative to our identity, and I think we should not kill human beings who are created in the image of God. That doesn't mean you do nothing. And then we have conversations that unfold from that point.
Well, let me articulate why we're different. Because you asked about responsibility to protect. The implication is, of the question, is that as a statesman or as a political organization, I've made a prudential judgment that I can prevent a particularly grave evil act, so let's say genocide, through a discriminate and proportional use of military force, which includes at least the threat and almost actually the use of lethal force. Okay, so that's the question, and the question is, can this bring us together? And the answer is no, right? Because the assumption of the question is that going limp in an act of nonviolent protest or other. Wait a second. The assumption is that the alternatives, whatever the nonviolent alternatives are, will not prevent the genocide. Right? Now, you have to make these judgments, right? And you can't rule, the statesman can't rule it out. Sure, if I reach the judgment that, oh yeah, I can send Christian peacemaker teams to Uganda to present genocide, then, oh, send the Christian peacemaker team, send the State Department, let's negotiate. Then you do that, right? But at some point, you reach the judgment, no, I can prevent genocide through the application of lethal force. And at that point, pacifist has to say, no, it's morally preferential to use nonviolent means that are not going to be ineffective in stopping the harm. And that's where we disagree. So no, it doesn't bring us together. It's not that the just warrior doesn't believe that at times you should use, protest, nonviolent, sleep-ins, eat-ins, all kinds of protests. The question is, what if I conclude that that's ineffective? And then I have to resort to lethal force. And just warrior says, if you reach that conclusion, you may have an obligation to, even an obligation rooted in Christian charity.
Is just war theory applied to current U.S. defense policy in particular? Is it compatible with the idea of perpetual war? Do you think? I've been doing some pondering on this recently, as we kind of look to a future where especially counter-terror operations, I think, are going to be smaller and longer-term scale as opposed to large, full-scale military operations, and the idea of war, as we conceive of it, is constantly changing. Does the theory change with it, and is it still compatible to, say, conduct preemptive, smaller counter-terror operations in foreign countries perpetually, as opposed to waiting until we have to invade a sovereign nation?
And can I just use my power as transporter to add to that? I'm particularly interested in that preemptive piece. Does the just war tradition have any room for the notion of preemptive strike? But answer his question before.
Actually, after 9/11, I heard a lot of the discussion that would go, this is a new, unique situation of sort of transnational, non-state organizations, and this is an entirely new phenomenon that the just war tradition is unfamiliar with. And the just war tradition was built in a notion to handle war between states. It's the exact opposite of the case. I mean, there weren't the established modern nation state, in the medieval period. It's like an Aquinas, it's like, so I think it was this notion of proper authority was meant to address that, right? So the question of legitimate authority is not given to these freelance organizations that pop up and now conduct terrorism, which is murder, deliberate targeting of non-combatants. So I think the just war tradition can handle that really quite easily. Now the question, so I think it handles, it can handle that. Now the notion of perpetual war is troubling, but you have to fight the enemy you got. You can't wish it away. So, I mean, that's the shorthand version. A lot more needs to be said. Now, preemption. Classically, just cause, it classically allowed for the notion of preemption, but in terms of a traditional, conventional force-on-force environment, it always, it had to do with, I don't have to wait until a foreign army crosses my borders in order to conduct the first strike. So if the question is really, may the just war tradition strike first? The answer is yes. And Paul Ramsey wrote very articulately and eloquently on this, that In fact, he argued that the notion, that he called it the aggressor-defender model, was not part of the tradition. Now, the question is, what will trigger a legitimate, just, first use? Classically, it's like, you notice the mobilization, so you get intelligence about their mobilizing, it has to do with questions of imminent, how imminent is the attack? Do I have to wait until they fully mobilize to do me harm? And the tradition says no. And in fact, when Aquinas talks about just cause, you may attack to retake something wrongfully taken. And what was the one that nobody likes these days? To punish evil, right? So particularly, and this applies today in terms of a particularly grave offense outside my realm. Aquinas says, yeah, because there was a retributive element. To tell the story, the early modern period, as you discussed, that kind of went away, and the natural lawyers wanted not to allow, Elizabeth to intervene on the sake of the Protestants were getting the hell kicked out of them, in another realm, and so it became a much more complex issue, and they didn't want to allow those preemptive or the interventions to prevent grave evil. But now it's reinserting itself in terms of what do we do when there's genocide and the responsibility to protect that.
The only thing I'll say is, and this betrays other aspects of my politics, but if you want a great example of legitimate preemption, and here I put sort of scare quotes around preemption, is look at 1967 and the Six-Day War. Did Israel preemptively strike Egypt and Syria? And, you see the mobilization, you see the closing of the Straits of Tiran, you hear the promises to drive Israel into non-existence, into the ocean, on and on and on and on. But you see the peacekeepers being kicked out of Sinai, all of that. But no, Egypt and Syria and Jordan hadn't technically taken a shot. But for Israel to have waited until they did would have been a dereliction of sovereign duty.
I just feel the need to make one comment because pacifism seemed to me to be caricatured a few minutes ago. Interestingly, if I were to engage, if I were talking just about the just war theory and not defending pacifism right now, I would agree with most everything you just said, by the way, in line with just war theory. But I do want to say that we often talk about intervening in genocides. Emmanuel Katangala, who's a Ugandan theologian that now teaches at the University of Notre Dame, has a book called Mirror to the Church. And it's about the genocide that happened in Rwanda. And his question, similar to mine about Germany, is why in Rwanda, where 85% of the people were self-identified as Christians, that they could imagine slaughtering each other. Why is that? Again, it goes back to my claim that we need to train disciples. We need to have a holistic understanding of the Christian faith so that Christians cannot imagine that they're free to slaughter each other, even at the foot of the altar in Catholic churches in Rwanda. It's horrible. And how do we address that? I think his book is a wonderful way to reflect on that, about what it means to be Christian and how Christians need to be deeper, more meaningful Christians, so they couldn't imagine doing that.
Just to put a positive note to this, it's interesting to note that in terms of getting Christians not to just slaughter one another, both the just war tradition and the pacifist tradition would go some distance in doing it, right? So you could
Going back to
just
the agreement,
that.
this might be where we would come close to agree.
Yeah.
Who's first? Okay. To piggyback on this question of preemption and the logical consequences of this, it would seem that there's only two possible outcomes that this could lead to. Either that it's potential to have two sides, each having just claims for war, or having to admit that there are defensive wars that are inherently unjust, right? You either have to say the person who did the preemption, the person who's then defending themselves, does not have a just cause to defend themselves, which means there's some categories of defensive war that's unjust, which doesn't seem consistent with my general knowledge of just war theory. Or there's a potentiality where two warring factions can each claim justice simultaneously. And so my question is twofold. Is there another option that I'm not seeing? And if there's not, and that second option of each claiming justice simultaneously, isn't this likely to lead to more war? And then isn't the just war theory having a potentiality of actually creating more conflict than it's actually preventing?
I would say, from my impression of the just war theory, actually the first option you gave would be the right answer. That there's some defensive wars which would be unjust, because you're in that sentence you're using defensive in a very physical sense of like the action is after the preemption. Right. But if the preemption was just, that means you've already done something evil to justify. You're threatening essentially the one that's preempting you. That's why they're justly preempting you. So. In that sense, you are the aggressor, even though you haven't fired the bullet first. That would be my understanding.
And Thomas Aquinas agrees with you, right? I mean, if you look at Thomas Aquinas' just cause, you've got punish evil, you've got take back what has wrongly been taken, and defend the innocent, right? And self-defense isn't specifically mentioned, because it's a qualified position. It's either going to be caught up in one of those three things, or it's illegitimate.
I'm not going to answer the question just by reference. James Turner Johnson, somewhere does a lot of discussion about how the tradition handles situations in which both appear to have a just cause, and how the tradition handles that. But I've been up here too long, and I can't recall it from where we wrote it. It's been a while. But it's brilliant. Whatever it is.
Sorry, you go for a run. If I can be a little bit reductive in summarizing kind of the two positions on just war we have on stage, there's one contingent of people on stage who say that there are circumstances in which war or violence can be a morally valid tool in your toolbox for addressing injustice. And there's one on stage who says no. This is, I guess, more directed toward the people who are proponents of just war theory. We've heard a lot about the circumstances in which it's okay to start considering using the war tool. But I haven't heard much conversation in my life before now about what just war theory has to say about the limits of that tool, and when you recognize that once you've broken it out, maybe it's how you recognize when it's not being effective and when to step back and go back to other tools in the toolbox. Oh, I have to add a question mark. So can you fill me in on some of that thought, please?
I'll start. Yeah, there are cases where the theory would tell you the decision is to not go to war. So the one I come to now and then is prospect of success as a criterion. So if you know that waging the war, you won't succeed, all you'll succeed in doing is getting a lot of your own people killed and a lot of their people killed, and you'll fail, then justice would tell you not to prosecute that war. So I'm not going to try and invent an example, but I think.
I can add, I think you're also saying you've already declared war.
Yes.
And it's becoming clear that maybe that wasn't the best idea, or at least going forward it's not the best idea. And I think the difficulty is it's so difficult to actually disentangle yourself at that point. And we have, how can just war tradition have some teeth maybe in the midst of a war and saying, we need to conclude peace, even though we're going to lose a little face by doing so.
Yeah, I think one of the beauties of the just war theory is because it's based on justice, it's like a virtue you're supposed to always be practicing. And that means like moment by moment you're reconsidering, is it still worth it now? Is it still worth it now? Like, not in a dumb way every second, but you're kind of redoing it, and at some point you may conclude you have to change the path.
Yeah, I thought you were going to ask the use and valid question, but you're actually not. It's a good question. And I think the guidance, again, is you go to war to establish tranquility of order, that the peace, the intent. So if you find yourself in the middle of a situation in which the best you can get is, you sue for peace. You don't cut off negotiations, and you end it now, and you maybe only take a half a loaf. Even that you can't. You realize, boy, if I could sweep through this country, I could establish a greater peace, but I can't do that. Well, and the just war tradition, again, it will not give you a calculus of when you should pull up short or when you should keep going, or a calculus of how many more of my own do I have to sacrifice in order to achieve that? Or even the really difficult question, how many non-combatants will be even unintentionally harmed in order to secure that peace? Now, those are hard questions. What we have heard already is the case that we know that in pursuing that peace, we cannot directly and intentionally target non-combatants. We can intentionally and directly target combatants and even allow for the foreseen but unintended harm to non-combatants. And all that gets weighed in terms of proportionality, you said proportionality of ends, right? So it may sound abstract, and it doesn't provide a definite answer, but that's why it's a craft. It's not mathematical calculus.
I'll make a partial segue to dinner. This will be brief. A good case study for that would be Road 1, and the whole question of whether or not what they did at the very end was simply the sunk costs fallacy, or if there was something bigger going on. So, shout out to
We have time for just one more. So I don't know who was next. I'm going to you because you're closest. So anyone else with questions, come to dinner afterwards.
So this took an interesting turn, this discussion, because my question is going to be, does the just war theory speak to proportionality in terms of retributive justice, either within a society, like sentencing criminals, or in foreign relations, such as chemical warfare on one's own people, and how that should be punished? Especially when those things are in control.
Yeah, so proportion. So the jus ad bellum, or the rightness up toward war, or justice toward war, determining whether you should go to war, has, as a prudential calculation, a proportionality of ends. But in terms of the use in bellum, there's a proportionality criterion in which
some people will call it micro-proportionality.
A proportionality of means, right? And so you ask, what is the, and usually proportionality of means is to ask the question, particularly the harm done, particularly in a conflict, to non-combatants. And broadly understood, not just simply the death and harm to physical people, but to the overall political order that, and to the peace that you would otherwise establish. So there's a proportionality of going towards war. Is the overall good that you hope to achieve, even in a just war that meets the three theological criteria of just cause, intent, and sovereign authority, the prudential judgment may be, I can't do it until you don't. And then the proportionality of means, saying it makes the judgment that the kind of harm being done once the war starts is excessive in relation to what you're trying to prevent. But I have an article in the New Atlantis about 6-7 years ago, in which I discuss abuses and they're rampant of the use in bello notion of proportionality to what I think the tradition argues. By the way, international law is getting awful on this, just horrible, which is another issue. But New Atlantis proportionality, and I'll just sort of leave that as a little plug where I discuss that.
I'll give a brief crack at it. This isn't exactly what you've asked, but two things on proportionality. One is you've got to fight in such a way that, and this is, I think, just reiterating some ways what Keith just said, you've got to fight in such a way that peace is possible. If you've gassed your own people, or if you've used weapons that are so, even though dead is dead, whether it's a bullet, a barrel bomb, or a chem weapon, the moral imagination is so repulsed by certain things that you may never be able to successfully rule over a particular constituency once you've done something like that. So proportionality has to aim toward having peace in the end. The other thing about proportionality is I also don't I think we have to be careful not to fight in such a limited way that the enemy does not know they've been beaten. Because you're not going to have peace if the defeated party isn't convinced that they've actually been defeated. And there's all sorts of red flags that go up when I say that, rightly so. But the enemy needs to know they've been beaten. That's a grace.
So, can we have a round of applause for